speaker this hour is Brother Bruce Stulting. He and his wife Sue have 3 children and 11 grandchildren. His son Jeb had emergency surgery just, was it Friday? Friday. And so I want to be remembering him. He's apparently doing fairly well as you could after surgery. But he was on his way home from camp and got a call and had to detour to the hospital. He does work with Bible youth camps, and along with being an instructor in Truth Bible Institute, he works with the Fish Hatchery Road congregation in Huntsville, Texas, and serves as one of the elders there. And he always does an excellent job. We appreciate him greatly for his work's sake. The chapter in the book is an excellent material. I know that he won't get to all of it in the time allotted this evening, but I would encourage you to read that chapter. It's an excellent work and one that needs to be read by everyone. And so now then, Brother Bruce comes.
I appreciate the fact that you said I worked with the congregation at Fish Hatchery Road in Huntsville. A lot of people don't think preachers work. I appreciate you recognizing that fact, one preacher to another. See, you got to plug. That's it. That's what it is. Appreciate everybody's prayers. I know a lot of you know about my son's injuries. He suffered in an accident a few years ago, and this surgery that he just had Friday is an ongoing issue that he's had with that. And I appreciate all the prayers that you've offered in the past, and ask that you continue to pray for him. He's got a wife and 3 little boys, 7, 4, and 3. And so if he had never had an accident and was injured or had any surgery, he'd still need your prayers with 3 boys, 7, 4, and 3. But no, they're good kids. But I appreciate your prayers and all your concerns and questions about his health. We're going to be talking tonight, at least in this session, about is there an absolute standard of morality? And since the theme of the lectureship is morality, it's essential that we have a standard. Otherwise, we're just wasting our time. If there's no absolute standard of morality, the best we can do is offer our opinion. And that's it. And you know what they say about opinions. I'm entitled to my opinion, and you're entitled to your opinion. And it just so happens that your opinion ain't any good, right? So and that's the nature of opinions. No, if there's no standard to which we can appeal, then that's the best we can do. Is just say, well, that's the way I think it ought to be. And Michael says, well, no, I think it ought to be this way. And I say, tough, you know. And that's the best we could do. Morality is the character of being in accord with the principles or standards of right conduct. Morals constitute a standard of conduct and are seen as governing the ways humans live. In contrast, immorality is a general term describing any conduct that transgresses moral prohibitions, conflicts with moral principles, or violates proper moral sensitivities. While morality involves the actual practice of living out one's belief, ethics, on the other hand, is the study of why these practices are moral or immoral. Another author stated it this way: the words ethics and morals are commonly used interchangeably. When we use the term ethics, we are referring to a fixed set of moral laws by which one can measure human behavior. Defining ethics in this way gives us a basis for making moral judgments. Ethics can be thought of as the standards, laws, or principles that individuals are obligated to obey. Said in another way, he continues, we can understand ethics as a set of standards, what ought to be, by which one evaluates human behavior and judges it as morally right or wrong. This term mores is indicative of the kind of behavior in which a person engages, either good or bad. Yet without moral laws or ethics, it makes no sense to speak of moral evaluation. And so, again, according to this, we learn that morals deal with the evaluation of conduct, right or wrong, good or bad, and ethics, then, is the set of rules or standards and or laws behind morals to which one appeals when determining if an action is moral or immoral. And so in the remainder of this lesson, we will prove, number one, that there is a universal moral standard, and we're going to prove what the standard is, and then we're going to discuss some practical considerations concerning moral obligation. Well, first off, let's look at some proof that there is a universal moral standard. And the fact is, no rational person can successfully deny the existence of a universal moral standard. You cannot successfully, they can deny it, but they can't successfully deny it. Whenever a victim cries out for justice, or a parent sets boundaries for their child, or one person opposes another person, a universal standard of morality is implied. The fact that one claims that he is right implies a system of morality. In settling any disagreement, there must be a standard beyond the two in disagreement, the disputants, that will determine which, if either is right or either is wrong. They could both be right. They could be. Well, no, they can't. Can they? No, they can't. You see, either one is right and the other is wrong, or they both could be wrong, but they can't be both right at the same time. You see? Otherwise, we have a contradiction. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Morality is universally and uniquely human. It is a human trait among the creatures of the earth. A snake doesn't feel pangs of guilt when he raids the hen house and eats the chicken's eggs. A lion doesn't feel guilt when he eats a baby gazelle. And even infidels will recognize that humans have a sense of right and wrong and a sense of moral obligation that doesn't exist among the animals in the animal kingdom. Simpson stated, "A man is the result of a purposeless and materialistic process that did not have him in mind." In other words, we're just rocks and dirt that became animated and somehow became us. Didn't have us in mind. But then he goes on to admit good and evil, right and wrong, concepts irrelevant in nature from the human viewpoint, become real and pressing features of the whole cosmos as viewed morally, because morals arise only in man. Now that's somebody that believes in evolution, but he recognizes the fact that morality is a human concept. It's not seen in the animal kingdom. The existence of the need for morality are thus apparent. No sane person will argue that absolutely anything goes. The expression ought and ought not are as much a part of the atheist vocabulary as it is among the believers. And they cannot deny it, and they will not. Think about it. Suppose Dub wanted to punch Michael in the head. Would Michael have a right to say that that's not right behavior? Could he say that? And if he's over there saying, yeah, I could, but would he be right? Would he be right? Would he have a principle that he could appeal to say, see, Dub, you shouldn't do that? Even if it makes Dub happy. Even if it makes Dub happy. I know a lot of people probably like to punch Michael in the head. But the question is that a right action? Is it morally right or morally wrong? And that's what we're talking about. And not only punching somebody in the head, but any action that we engage in. We need to be concerned about whether it's right or wrong, good or bad, moral or immoral. And without a standard, truly anything would go. Anything would go. the nature of the mind of man proves that there is a universal moral standard. You know, the Bible talks about the mind of man and often refers to the mind as the heart. Well, the Bible heart is divided up into 4 separate parts. It consists of the intellect, the conscience, the emotions, and the will. When we think about the intellect, with the intellect, the Bible says that man thinks. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 4. He reasons. Mark 2 and verse 8. He understands. Matthew chapter 3 and verse 15. And he believes. Romans chapter 10 verse 9 and 10. The conscience urges one then to do what he believes to be right and discourages that which is wrong. Thus it can be pricked or cut, as we see in Acts chapter 2 verse 37 and chapter 5 and verse 33. Or it can condemn or commend one's actions, Romans chapter 2 and verse 15. With the emotions then, man loves, Matthew 22 verse 37. He despises, 2 Samuel 6 and verse 16. He desires, Romans chapter 10 and verse 1. And he trusts, Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 5. The will then gives man determination, and so he intends, Hebrews 4 and verse 12. He purposes, Acts 11 and verse 23. And he renders obedience, Romans 6 verse 17 and 18. And so this chapter in our book demonstrates the clear connection between the 4 component parts of the mind. The intellect gathers the information by which our actions are judged. The conscience takes that information and processes it and determines whether the action is right or wrong. And then the action is either condemned or commended. And based on the determination of the conscience, this then affects our emotions, and we either have guilt and sorrow or remorse if our actions are wrong, and we fail to act in, and if we fail in, or rather if we act in a way that is right, then we feel joy and happiness or satisfaction. Now the emotions will affect our will, which determines then our actions. So we go from the intellect, the information we gather about things in general, that affects the conscience, which affects the emotions, then that determines our actions or our will. And that's the way the Bible talks about the human heart. And in fact, it's easy to see that that's how we operate. The common man on the street, if we would give him that material, would readily agree with it. Yeah, I understand that. And so when we think about this idea, it must be understood that the conscience can only act upon the information that it's given. If the intellect has faulty information, then the conscience can make incorrect judgments and either commend wrong actions or condemn right actions. And I believe that's happening to our brethren in the brotherhood right now. There's a lot of brethren right now that, based on faulty information, that are making wrong judgments, that are acting in the wrong way, and because they have wrong information, they feel good about themselves. I'm doing the right thing. And then they turn around and condemn the actions of others who really are doing the right thing. It's all based on the fact that they have wrong information. You know, Paul is a great example of that fact, isn't it? When he was a Jewish champion for their cause, he says, men and brethren, he said in Acts chapter 23 and verse 1, I have lived in all good conscience before God unto this day. And most people here know where we're going with this. Yet Paul admits, I thought verily within myself. Notice, I thought, there's his intellect working, and his conscience never bothered him. Yet I thought within myself that I ought, there's that word implying moral obligation, I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which things also I did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from chief priests. And when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them, and I punished them often in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme. And being exceedingly mad against them, I persecuted them even unto strange cities. Acts chapter 26, verses 9 through 11. How could Paul claim to have lived in all good conscience to the present day, and yet have done such despicable things to the Lord's church? Well, the answer is he had faulty information. He was acting on faulty information, which led his conscience to condemn commend wrong behavior. However, when Paul received correct information, his conscience then in turn condemned his actions of the past and caused him much sorrow and regret. And in fact, in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 15, he considered himself the chief of sinners because of what he had done. But he did all that and never once violated his conscience. And the reason is he didn't have the right information. All right, to tie together the idea of moral obligation and conscience, we refer to Paul's statement in Romans chapter 2, verse 14 and 15. He says, "For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, they having not the law, are a law unto themselves, which show the works of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another." From this we learn that although the Gentiles had no revealed written law like the Jews, they nevertheless had a law. It was a moral law, and they felt an obligation to live up to it. Their conscience testified in regard to certain moral obligations in agreements with the law, the moral law, urging the right and discouraging the wrong. Furthermore, by correct reasoning, they were able to make moral judgments on questions of right and wrong. If they did what was right, or judged to be right by the urging of their conscience, then their thoughts, rational insights, pronounced approval of their actions. On the other hand, if they did what they thought was understood was wrong, then their conscience condemned their actions. And they were able to reason correctly on these things because of the information that they had. The conscience is uniquely and universally human. No other living creature possesses a conscience. By the same token, every human being has a conscience. Okay, so this is uniquely and universally human. At this point, we're going to consider some possible objections to the fact that the conscience proves that we have a universal moral standard. First, some would attempt to deny the universal moral standard of the conscience because the conscience seems to be radically different from society to society and person to person. Although there may exist some differences in moralities, as C.S. Lewis points out, that the differences have not amounted to anything like total difference. They clearly would not, he would say, differ radically. In fact, there is generally broad agreement that lying, promise-breaking, killing, and so on are indeed wrong. And these are universal concepts. How can all of men throughout all of time understand that these things are wrong except there be a universal moral standard? Furthermore, even if there are differences, this does not argue against a universal standard of morality because we have allowed for the possibility that the intellect can be educated. There may be some societies that would do things different than other societies, but they don't have the same information. Like you go to Africa, and some of the women go topless over there. All right? You go to some places like Germany, and they sit down to a meal, and what do they drink? Well, they wash it down with a beer. You go to France, and what do they wash their meals down? Well, with a big old glass of wine. All right? Now see, there's differences in those standards, but people can be educated. Now the fact is, this is what we need to realize. Even if there are differences, this doesn't necessarily argue against a universal standard. This is true because we've allowed for the possibility of the intellect to be educated with respect to the content of morality. We've already given Paul as an example. And the conscience sanctions moral insight and must operate within the limits of the information that it's given. A.E. Taylor observed, he said, but it is undeniable fact that men not only love and procreate, they also hold that there is difference between right and wrong. There are things which they ought to do and other things which they ought not to do. Different groups of men living under different conditions and in different ages may disagree widely on the question of whether a certain thing belongs in the first or second of these classes. They may draw the line, he says, in different places, okay, but at least they all agree that there is a line that must be drawn. Okay? And so even though we might differ from age to age, society to society, everybody in society accepts the fact that we need rules to govern us. You see, so they're appealing to a standard of morality even if they deny it. Although man may disagree on a particular point of morality, they cannot deny the feeling of moral obligation. Second, some may have suggested that the deep felt sense of moral obligation is nothing more than herd instinct. In other words, you get enough people living together in the same place, sooner or later, simply because they're together, they're going to start acting alike. It's like a herd of cattle. They all act alike. Okay, or a herd of elephants. They all act alike. You have a pod of whales, they all act alike. Well, you get a bunch of humans together, sooner or later, they're going to all act alike. And so they try to say that's the source of the universal appearance of morality. However, the most basic herd instinct is self-preservation. Yet when one hears a cry for help, he finds himself faced with two strong desires. Number one, a desire to render aid, resulting from herd instinct to protect, and then also with the desire to keep out of danger, resulting from the self-preservation instinct. And yet there is another impulse, something with binding force and overriding character, the feeling that one ought suppress the feeling of self-preservation and follow the desire to render aid. This feeling of oughtness judges between desire 1 and 2 and places one action over the other. This sense of oughtness must exist separate from the above choice, 1, to flee and save yourself, or the other choice, to stay and render aid. There has to be a standard of morality to judge between those actions that's outside the choice itself. All right. An onlooker could correctly judge a person to be a hero or a coward simply based on what that person did or didn't do in response for the call of help. The fact that the stronger of these two instincts, which is self-preservation, save my own skin, may lose out to the desire to render aid, is further evidence that we are aware of our moral obligation. And that we would judge a man. Why would we judge a man a coward if he saved himself and let the little child burn up in a building and didn't try to rescue him? Or saw a child fall into the river and didn't render aid? I'm not going to help that guy, I might drown. Why would that be wrong to let the child drown and never try to offer help? Why would we call that guy a coward? Why would we call the firefighter a hero that gave his life in trying to rescue people out of the Twin Towers on 9/11? Why would we call him a hero? And we would call those people that crashed into the thing and killed all those people cowards. You see, which is right? Which is right? Were those people, those firefighters, those first responders that died, were they just simply foolish for going in there? Were they foolish? Of course not. You see, they understood this principle of moral obligation that overrides our self-preservation instinct and would sacrifice everything, even their life, to try to save another. You see, that's evidence right there of our sense of moral oughtness, our moral obligation. Third, some would suggest that the conscience is simply the effect of social conditioning. According to this view, the demands of the conscience are directly related to society. The development of the conscience, then, they would say, is a process whereby a child witnesses certain things that society would approve of or disapprove of, and then because of social pressure, they would gradually or immediately begin to accept and express his or her own approval or disapproval of those actions. Since the conscience operates on information it has, there is an allowance for social conditioning of one's concept of morality. However, as previously discussed, this is the intellectual side of a person. But there's another side, which includes the conscience, which cannot be adequately explained by social conditioning. The first difficulty with this position is called the is-ought fallacy. In other words, just because that's something that someone is doing doesn't automatically imply it is something they ought to be doing. We can do this on an individual basis or on a societal basis. You know, back during World War II, it was society's decision in Germany to exterminate the Jews. That's what they were doing, but that doesn't mean it was what they ought to be doing. And so, if we are in society in Germany during World War II, and our morality is based on society, then we couldn't say, nor could anyone else say, that the Germans acted wrongly, because they were just conforming to society. But we remember the trials, don't we? And what do they appeal to? A standard higher than civil law? There's a law that guides all men. Right? Yeah, we understand what that law is. That's the law of God. You know, it's often the case that a person would feel a moral obligation to adopt an action that is altogether different from that of society. And sometimes we ought to. This decision is made in relation to something that is different from societal conditioning, some law that transcends societal law and obligates everyone. To summarize this section, we know that all men have has an experience of moral obligation. This experience is the response to an ethical law that obligates all men to act in a certain moral way. The conscience is that part of man that supports one's moral perception and imposes certain moral obligations on an individual. Since it is evident that there is a universal moral standard, we're going to move on and look at the origin. What is the origin of morality? When we think about morality and its origin, there's only one of two places. It's either man or God. That's the only two possibilities. You know, it's kind of like Jesus' question to the Pharisees. John's baptism, whence is it? Is it of God or man? And that's what we're left with in the sense of morality. When we think about it, if morality is from God, it is in man due to creation. That's just simply the way we're made. Otherwise, morality would have to be by the process of evolution. We begin by stating that it is clear that raw matter, that from which we come, dead rocks and dirt, raw matter is powerless to evolve any sense of moral consciousness. Have you ever seen a moral rock or an immoral rock? I had an uncle that was killed in a cave-in. Was that just bad dirt that covered him up and smothered him? Should we hold the dirt that smothered him to death culpable for his death? Well, see, if we're going to say that that's the source of morality, why not? You see, that's how absurd this really is. And so we outright deny this. Consider the following inadvertent admission by Simpson. He said, discovery that the universe apart from man or before his coming lacks and lacked any purpose or plan has the inevitable corollary that the working of the universe cannot provide any automatic, universal, eternal, or absolute criteria of right and wrong. You understand what he's saying there? Before man existed, there was no sense of right and wrong. There's no moral obligation. And if man came up through evolution, that would be the case. because rocks and dirt and animals do not possess any kind of morality. Thus, atheists contend, as they must, that there is no ultimate, absolute, ethical truth. Okay? And guess who's teaching our children in college and what they're teaching them? Most of those people in colleges are college are at least agnostic in their beliefs. Most of them believe in evolution, and if they believe in evolution, then they're going to be led to this conclusion if they're consistent. And guess what they're teaching our young people? We need lectureships like this. We really do. We need to be teaching this from the pulpits in our Bible class, especially to our young people, because they're going to face it when they grow up and go to college. This means that all morality is, in fact, according to the atheist, relative. Moral relativity is the view that when it comes to questions of morality, there are no absolute and no objective right and wrong moral rules, are merely personal preferences. That's what I was saying about Doug punching Michael a while ago. If Michael objected and there's no moral standard, he wouldn't have any objection to make. It's not right or wrong. It would be irrelevant, morally speaking, whether it would be just as right for Doug not to hit Michael as it would for him to hit him. There will be no difference, morally speaking, according to the atheists. It's just personal preference. It's the result of one's cultural, sexual, or ethnic orientation. Moral relativism is demonstrated in three similar philosophies: existentialism, nihilism, and pragmatism. I studied when I was in preacher training school. We had a lot of classes on philosophy. I thought, that's just crazy. I came here to study the Bible. But you know what? I know better now. That's not just crazy. We need to be studying the philosophies of men so that we'll know how to defeat them. I guarantee you. Because your kids, when they go to college, they're going to get a snoot full of liberal philosophy. And we need to be able to help them study through that and prepare them to be able to answer that when they go to class. Otherwise, they may be overwhelmed. Existentialism gives emphasis to individual experience, freedom, and choice. Although difficult to define, existentialism stresses absolute individual existence, and consequently is based on subjectivity subjectivity, individual freedom, and choice. This philosophy rejects absolute objective truth in general. Now this is truth in general, and for our purposes, moral truth. In other words, there's no truth out there. Whatever's true is what I find it to be through my experience in life. And whatever I find true is true for me, and you may find something else with similar experience and come to a different conclusion. But whatever your conclusion is, since we're all individuals, you're right and I'm right. And that's crazy. That's just crazy. Nihilism, closely associated with existentialism, has its basis in the atheistic notion that since there is no God, there can be no rational justification for ethical norms. I bet there's people on death row that would like to know that. Think about it. If there's no justification for ethical norms, what right do we have to incarcerate anybody for any length of time? That was just where his experience brought him to that point. In Doug's experience, it was the right thing to punch Michael in the head. In Michael's experience, it was his judgment not to get punched in the head. But according to the nihilists, they're both right. Pragmatism looks at let me go back to Sartre. This is a comment that he made regarding nihilism. Sartre contended that whatever one chooses to do is right. Value is attached to the choice itself, so that we can never choose evil. Better look out. You better look out. Pragmatism looks at the consequences of an action. According to the consequence, it determines whether the action is right or wrong. Thus, if an action accomplishes one's desired end, it's right. If an action doesn't accomplish the desired end, it was wrong. And I could do the same thing and get the right consequence one time, and do the same thing another time and get the wrong consequence. If things didn't work out that time, it could be right one time and wrong the next time. You see how silly that is? These philosophies result in what we call irrationalism. Each of these philosophies rejects and repudiates the law of rationality. The law of rationality states that we ought to justify our conclusions by adequate evidence. They further violate the law of contradiction, which states for things nothing can be A or not A at the same time. For propositions, it cannot be a proposition A can't be true and false at the same time. When moral relativism affirms that an action can be right in one situation and wrong in another situation, he violates these laws of correct reasoning and becomes irrational. The Warren-Mattson debate, Brother Warren proves that atheism is false because it implies a logical contradiction, and he uses this very material that we're talking about to prove it. Now here's the thing. If morality either comes from God or atheism, right, which implies evolution, and we prove that atheism is not true because it implies a logical contradiction, what do we have left? God. And He's the source of our moral obligation. We're morally obligated, and I'm going to sum this next section up, not because God said it. That would make it just really a whim, wouldn't it? It'd be arbitrary. In other words, something's not right or wrong just simply because God said it was right or wrong. Nor did God say it was right because something else outside of Him already determined it was right. It's right because of His nature. You know, the Bible says, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." God was holy before He ever created man, because that's part of His nature. Right and wrong is part of God's essence. And since God never changes, we have a standard of morality revealed to us in the Bible, His Word, His inspired Word, that we can depend on, we can rely on, we can go to it and always find the right answer to any question that we have. If we want to know if it's right for Doug to punch him in the head, we can say, no, it's not right. Why? Is that just my opinion? Is that his opinion because he don't want to get punched in the head? Is it right because Doug really wants to punch him in the head? Is it wrong because he doesn't? No, it's wrong because the Bible says it's wrong. And that's simply the matter of the fact. Thank you for